Tonight, we will explore the topic of white privilege and white fragility. And we are glad to have three presenters from our parish, Good Shepherd, and that is Marianne Ertman, Tony Burns, and Barb Messer-Connect. And I will introduce them a little bit later. Before going any further, we would like to acknowledge that this presentation comes to you on the ancestral land of the Menomonee Native American tribe, part of the Algonquin language family. We honor their elders past and present and thank them for the stewardship of this land. Marguerite, do you need another couple minutes or so?
Yeah.
Right. Well, then while we're waiting, I thought I would, as a follow-up to the topic we had last week on the Catholic Church and race, that I would mention that there are 6 African Americans who are up for sainthood. And I just like to mention them while we're waiting for Marguerite to put everybody into groups. There's Venerable Henriette Dillell of New Orleans. She founded the Sisters of the Holy Family, and these sisters attended to the needs of slaves and poor free Black people. She lived in the 1800s. Then there's Venerable Pierre Toussaint from New York. He was a hairdresser and a former slave. He purchased his freedom with money that he earned from his trade. There is Mary Mother Elizabeth Lang, a former slave, and she served as the first superior general of the Oblate Sisters in Baltimore. She founded this order so Black women could serve as religious sisters. They educated African American children. There's Father Augustus Tolton. He was America's first Black priest. He had to go to Rome to get his formation because no seminary in the United States would accept him. He had quite a fruitful ministry, however, and he founded the first Black church in Chicago. Sister Thea Bowman, she is the youngest of the group. She was a convert. She had a doctorate and she was quite a renowned educator. She founded a support group for African American sisters and helped create the first African American Catholic hymnal. And Marguerite and I were fortunate enough to be with her at presentations that she gave. She died in 1990 of cancer at a young age. And then we have Julia Greeley. She was a former slave, and after she was freed, after the emancipation, she helped the poor and she shared her faith with firefighters. So just a little update from last time. Are we ready to break out into small groups? Okay. Well, we will have a prayer as a part of PowerPoint tonight. It will be in the form of a song. So at this time, I would like to introduce our team of presenters. We'll start with Marianne Ertman. She was originally from Milwaukee. She moved to Menomonee Falls 10 years ago. She's been a member of Good Shepherd Parish since 1975. She's the mother of 7 children and the grandmother of 14. She's a graduate of Marquette University, and she has a certificate in lay ecclesial ministry from St. Francis Seminary. She is an ESL tutor at St. Michael Parish and a reader and a prayer leader at Good Shepherd. She is a retired Montessori teacher. Tony Burns grew up in Milwaukee. He went to Catholic schools all throughout his education. He moved to the suburbs after college. He has been a Catholic all his life and has been a member of Good Shepherd Parish since 1993. He's been active in social justice issues since he came to Good Shepherd. So I'd say that sends a positive message about our parish. He is a licensed private detective, paralegal, and security officer. He is the owner of his own business, Priority Legal Investigations, LLC. Tony has worked on thousands of cases and started his business to help the innocent and ensure that his clients get a fair trial. Many of his cases are through the State Public Defender's Office. He also serves as the Vice President of the Board of Directors of the Milwaukee Career Cooperative. He is a member of the Knights of Columbus, where he served 2 terms as the Grand Knight, and he belongs to numerous other organizations. Barb Messer-Connect has been a member of Good Shepherd since 1977. Her career placed her in chemical laboratories as a lab assistant. But Good Shepherd and Father Fran, our founding pastor, called her to be involved in the liturgy committee, immigration, and feeding the poor. She volunteered at St. Ben's Meal Program apart from the parish and was on the board there for 9 years. She has also served at Repairs of the Breach, Cathedral Center for Women and Children. And with her husband, Jeff, they developed a Just Faith program at the parish. Dearest to her heart has been her work with and for immigrants. She traveled to the School of the Americas in Georgia for 20 years to protest the training of mainly Latin American military officers by the United States Government of Defense, and made several trips to the US-Mexican border. We are honored to have our presenters tonight, Marianne, Tony, and Barb, and please join me in welcoming them tonight. Okay, let me share my screen.
Okay, so welcome to tonight's presentation on white privilege and fragility. And Barb and Tony and I are really happy to be with you on the 4th night of our racism series. We'll begin with the first half of our song, Change Our Hearts, and then end the presentation with the second half.
Change our hearts this time. Your word says it can be. Change our minds this time. Your life could make us free. We are the people your call set apart. Lord, this time, change our hearts. Brought by your hand to the edge of our dreams, 1 foot in paradise, 1 in the waste. Drawn by your promises, still we are lured by the shadows and the chains we leave behind. But change our hearts this time. Your word says it can be. Change our minds this time. Your life could make us free. We are the people your call set apart. Lord, this time, change our hearts. Now as we watch, you stretch out your hand, offering abundances, fullness of joy. Your milk and honey seem distant, unreal, when we have bread and water in our hands. But change our hearts this time. Your word says
So tonight we're going to be exploring the topics of white privilege and white fragility. And we're doing it not as experts, but as fellow explorers with humility and a desire to learn and change our hearts. Two excellent resources we used are Father Brian Mazengale's article on white privilege, which appeared in the National Catholic Reporter, and also Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. We'll also share our personal stories. Father Mazengale is a Black priest of the Milwaukee Archdiocese who is currently a professor of theology at Fordham University in New York. Robin DiAngelo is an author and workshop trainer of racial and social justice issues. It's important to look at white privilege and how it's ingrained in our society and how it affects and is harmful to Black people. Father Mazengale in his article wrote, "White privilege is assumed. No one gave white people an explicit class on the ways of whiteness and how it works in society. At some early age, you realized that no matter how bad things got for you, at least you would never be Black, because you realized without being told that being white makes life easier." We need to talk about white privilege, even though we ourselves may never have been guilty of blatant acts of prejudice or discrimination, even though it might be uncomfortable for us as white people. We need to talk about white privilege and racism because awareness and dialogue are the first steps to change our hearts and our attitudes. First, let's start with some definitions. White privilege. Dr. E. Kendall, in a 2002 article on understanding white privilege, defines it as an institutional rather than personal set of benefits to those of us who by race resemble the people who dominate the powerful institutions and positions in our country. In other words, on the basis of skin color, doors are open to us that are not open to other people. White fragility. Robin DiAngelo defines it as the white response to having our racial positions challenged. These include fear, defensiveness, silence, anger, withdrawal, and maybe even argumentation. And we'll talk more about some other claims in this area a little later. Racism. DiAngelo defines it as a system of racial inequality that benefits white people at the expense of people of color. And if you remember in our first session, Joan gave this definition from the Ignatian Spirituality Network. Racism involves one group having the power to carry out systemic discrimination through institutional policies and practices of society. And now we'll share our personal stories. Barb, growing up in a small town up north, Tony, growing up in the inner city of Milwaukee, and I, also growing up in the inner city of Milwaukee. We'll hear from Barb first.
My life story. I was one of 4 children raised in Rothschild, Wisconsin, located in the north central part of the state. It was a small paper mill town on the banks of the Wisconsin River. Growing up, our families were either Catholic or Lutheran, and most of our dads worked in the paper mill, which made our families similar in economic status. We were made up of European heritage. Most of our moms did not work out of the house, and our local public schools were not diverse. At one time, we had several children that were Native American. It was after marrying my husband Jeff and moving to Milwaukee that I met some of his friends from the Marquette football team who were African American. The apartments that we lived in Milwaukee were always in middle-class white neighborhoods. We did experience the racial unrest in the 1960s. My employment as a lab technician were at 2 international companies and then 1 smaller company owned by local businessmen. The larger firms offered me the privilege of meeting many immigrants from all over the world, places like Iraq, Russia, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, China, Korea. But sadly, I must say that none of them made any effort to hire people of color. If they did, it was for cleaning the building or menial factory type jobs. We moved to Racine for about 5 years, and then we moved to Menomonee Falls. We came back to this area in 1977. We have always lived in white neighborhoods and have not had to face the challenges experienced by Black people. Jeff and I continue to be involved in diverse issues and hope we can make a difference. Next, we'll hear from Mary Ann.
Thanks, Barb. My parents were immigrants from Austria. I grew up on 10th Lane and Chambers in Milwaukee. We belonged to St. Boniface Parish, which was started as a parish for German-speaking families. I went to the parish grade school. The first Black student in my grade came in 1950. I don't remember ever seeing any Black families in our church at that time. Then a Black family moved next door to us. In 1953, a realtor came to our house and said it would be a good idea to sell our house now because Negro families are moving in and our property values would go down. I told him that we had a nice Black family living next door, but the realtor scared my dad on the property value issue. And so we sold our house to a Black family and moved to 60th and Capitol. And more white families moved out of the parish. The school was closed and the St. Boniface property was sold in 1975 to the Milwaukee Public Schools for a replacement of the old North Division High School. The church was then located in a former grocery store on Titonia Avenue, and the parish was closed in 1994. It was part of my white privilege that my family was free to move anywhere we wanted, an option not open to many Black families. As a white person, I take for granted being able to go into a store and not be watched suspiciously by a security guard. When I was stopped by a police officer for speeding in the town of Brookfield a couple of years ago, he greeted me very courteously and he said, "Is everything okay?" And then he told me that I was over the speed limit of 35 miles an hour. He asked to see my driver's license, explained what I needed to do, where the courthouse was, and the procedure that would take place there. I got the ticket, but I also got courteous and respectful treatment. And now Tony will share his story.
Oh, I grew up in Milwaukee, went to all Catholic schools from grade school through college. We were usually one of the only Black families in the schools. While growing up in Milwaukee, I remember my parents talking about racist attitudes. They moved to Milwaukee in the 1950s, and I recall my dad saying that people would say to him, "We don't rent to the N word," and slam the door in his face. They had to live in a basement apartment. I recall the first time being called the N word. I was in fourth grade at St. Agnes on 25th and Capitol in Milwaukee. There again, one of a handful of Blacks at the school. I recall walking past a car that the school bully was about to get into. I heard his father tell his son, "Go beat up that N word." From that day forward, I was awakened to racism. I attended Dominican High School in Whitefish Bay. My family decided to move from the inner city to Whitefish Bay. We found a house near the school. Once the owners found out we were Black, they tripled the price. Between high school and college, I recall riding my bike down Green Bay Avenue near Bender. It was a 2-lane road at that time. I was traveling on the gravel side when a car came speeding out of nowhere and came within about a foot of me. The car came to a stop in front of me, spun its wheels, throwing gravel at me, and I fell off the bike. I thought they had lost control until I heard them yell the N word out the window. During my sophomore year at Dominican, I recall being pulled over on Port Washington Road in front of where Cops is located now. I was driving with 2 of my Black friends as passengers. We had just left track practice at Dominican and had our Dominican Letterman jackets on. We were told to exit the vehicle, were frisked, and the entire car was searched. I asked the officer why we were being treated this way. He informed me that some Black guys had robbed McDonald's, and his boss told him to stop all the Black people he sees and search them. After basketball games at Dominican, I recall the police sitting out in front of the school. If we left and headed towards Milwaukee, there was no problem. If we headed towards the lake, the police would follow us until we left Whitefish Bay. When I moved to Menomonee Falls in 1992, a neighbor came by and told me that people in this subdivision will not like you. Every time I saw this person, I heard a racial joke. I asked him to stop, but the comments continued. When I purchased my home in Menomonee Falls, the trash collector wouldn't take my trash. I live on a dead-end street, so the truck had to pass my house twice, ignoring my trash. After a month of this, I reported the problem to Waste Management. Most of my adult life, I can recall being followed in stores. I went into a department store in the Falls. There were only 3 people in the store, and I can hear someone over an open mic telling security to follow me around the store with the cameras. One of my sons has special needs. A few years back, he was walking home from our local bowling alley. He said he heard a car rev up its engine and come towards him. He ran up on someone's lawn. The car missed him, but went up the street, turned around, and came at him again, and then a third time. He stated the man yelled out for him to pack up his bags and go back to Africa, along with some other racial words. I deal with racism by saying, this is what being Black in America is all about, unfortunately. My mother told me once, sticks and stones can break your bones, but names can never harm you. Now when someone looks at me or calls me the N-word, I try to ignore them, or depending on my mood, I may smile at their ignorance and walk away, because I give the N-word no power. Now we'll hear from the next presenter. I don't have the sheet in front of me. Marianne, or is it Barb?
It's Barb. It's Barb, and I'm going to talk about white privilege. And I'm using an article by Father Brian Massengale. And I will quote from Father Brian, where he cites the incident in New York Central Park, where a Black man, Christian Cooper, was reported to the police by Amy Cooper, a white woman who was walking her dog unleashed. After he told her she should obey the signs that all dogs must be leashed in a public park, she called 911 to report that an African-American man was threatening her life. Christian Cooper recorded the incident to show that this was not true. Father Massengale stated, the woman assumed that her race would be an advantage, that she would be believed because she was white. We go on. Amy Cooper knew what she was doing, and so do we. Why did she act the way she did? She assumed that her lies would be more credible than his truth. She assumed that she would have the presumption of innocence. She assumed that he, the Black man, would have a presumption of guilt. She assumed the police would back her up. She assumed her white race would be an advantage. We call it white privilege. She assumed his race would be a burden, even an insurmountable one. She assumed the world should work for her and against him. She assumed that she had the upper hand in the situation. She assumed Christian Cooper could and would understand all of the above. And she was right. He clearly knew what was at stake, which is why he had the presence of mind to record what happened. Now we'll go back to Tony.
Lakeisha, Tyrone, Naftari, Ibrahim, Shaka. What's in a name? Kinky, nappy, woolly, unkept. What's in a hairstyle? Not much unless you're a person of color. I recall when my niece was born, my brother wanted to name her an African sounding name. I felt it was necessary for me to talk him out of it because potential employers may be able to tell that she was Black and she'd be discriminated against. For years, Black women felt it was necessary to straighten their hair because they may be chastised because of their appearance. The internet is full of stories of Black people losing jobs, not being able to play sports or allowed entrance because of their hairstyle that did not appeal to the white population. Things had gotten so bad that legislation was put into effect protecting Black hairstyles. The Crown Act is one of these new laws. While studying marketing at Cardinal Stritch, I recall two things that stood out in my mind related to race. One, Black women were not allowed to be on the cover of magazines like Vogue, Cosmopolitan, and Vanity Fair because data showed that the circulation dropped drastically. Number two, when people were shown commercials and magazines, light-skinned or biracial people were used because many white people could accept that image better. Marketing groups realized they were not realistically representing the entire population. Now they have drastically changed their marketing strategies to show more minorities of all colors and a lot of biracial couples. Okay, now we'll return to the next presenter, Marianne. Is that right?
Barb again.
Barb. Sorry, I don't have the sheet in front of me.
So Barb is going to present the white privilege checklist. This checklist was put together by Peggy McIntosh of Wellesley College, a Center for Research on Women. The following are examples of ways white individuals have privilege because they are white. Listen and quietly examine your life and decide where you have personally enjoyed privilege because you are white. So here we go. Number one, I can arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. I can be sure that my children will be given curricular materials that testify the existence of their race. I can go into a supermarket and find food that I grew up with, or into a hairdresser's shop and find someone who can deal with my hair. Whether I use checks, credit cards, or cash, I can count on my skin color not to work against the appearance of financial responsibility. I can take a job or enroll in a college with an affirmative action policy without my coworkers or peers assuming I got it because of my race. If a traffic cop pulls me over, or if the IRS audits my tax return, I can be sure I was not singled out because of my race. I can choose a public accommodation without fearing that people of my race cannot get in or will be mistreated. I can be pretty sure of having my voice heard in a group in which I am the only member of my race. I went to a very diverse school and lived in a very diverse neighborhood. The question is not whether the claim is true, but how does this claim function in a conversation? These claims function in a similar way. They all exempt the person from any responsibility for or participation in the problem. They take race off the table and they close rather than open any further explanation. In doing so, they protect the racial status quo. We'll move on and we'll hear from Mary Ann.
Thanks, Barb. The good, bad binary. Now that we've shared our stories, let's delve into white fragility. In her book, D'Angelo describes two kinds of claims that make it difficult for white people to have any meaningful dialogue about racism. The first is the good, bad binary. These are the claims made by white people. Good, not racist. Bad, bigoted. I'm sorry, bad, racist. Good, educated. Bad, bigoted. Good, open-minded. Bad, prejudiced. Good, well-intentioned. Bad, mean-spirited. D'Angelo states that this good-bad binary is the most effective adaptation of racism in modern history. Prior to the civil rights movement, it was socially acceptable for white people to openly proclaim their superiority. But when white Northerners saw that what Black people endured during the civil rights protests, they were appalled. These images became the archetypes of racists. After the civil rights movement, one could not be a good person and be racist. To accomplish this adaptation, racism needed to be reduced to simple, isolated, and extreme acts of prejudice, rather than the prevalence of systemic racism. Racists were those white people in the South who had segregated schools and clubs and white-only drinking fountains. Nice people, well-intentioned white people, could not be racist. Now Barb will present another set of claims.
Thank you, Marianne. When Robin DiAngelo talks about racism in her workshops, she says the following. When I talk about racism, I hear the same claims rooted in a good, bad binary. I organize these claims in two categories, both of which label the person as good and therefore not racist. The first set claims color blindness. I didn't see the color, and or I have not been near people of color, and or I have general fond regard for people of color, therefore I'm free of racism. Both categories rest on the good binary, good-bad binary, and can be and often are used interchangeably. They don't need to make sense. They just need to position the speaker as a good person, free of racism, and end the discussion. So let's look at colorblind claims include, I was taught to treat everyone the same. I don't see color. I don't care if you're pink, purple, or polka dotted. Everyone struggles, but if you only work hard. So it just happens to be black. And that has nothing to do with what I'm about to tell you. My parents were not racist. That's why I'm not racist. If people are respectful to me, I'm respectful to them regardless of race. So now we'll look at color celebrate. These claims that persons see and embraces racial diversity and differences. So here we go. I work in a very diverse environment. I have people of color in my family. We don't like how white our neighborhood is, but we have to move here because of the schools. I marched in the 60s. I adopted a child from China. My grandchildren are multiracial. I went to a very diverse school. I lived in a very diverse neighborhood. The question is not whether the claim is true, but how does the claim function in a conversation? These claims function in a similar way. They all exempt the person from any responsibility for or participation in the problem. They take race off the table and they close rather than open any further explanation. In doing so, they protect the racial status quo. Marianne?
Thanks, Barb.
Sure.
So we heard about white privilege, white fragility, and the claims that people make, proving that they're not racist. How do we counteract white privilege and white fragility? What's being done and what can we do? In counteracting white privilege and white fragility, we need to look at how racism is manifest in our own lives and in society. I am affected by the forces of racism in a society in which I will be seen as white and treated as white. And the focus on individual acts masks the larger issue of systemic racism. This is the root of nearly all white defensiveness and claims on the issue. D'Angelo uses the example of a pier. When viewed from above, the pier seems to simply float on the water. The top view of the pier signifies the surface aspect of our claims not being racist. The pier, in fact, is not floating at all, but it is propped up by pillars beneath the surface of the water. In the same way a pier sits on submerged pillars, the beliefs supporting our racial claims are hidden from our view. And sometimes this is called unconscious or implicit bias. To topple the pier, we need to become aware of and uproot the pillars of systemic racism. In telling the story of Amy Cooper, Father Massengill wrote that she knew she had the support of an unseen yet very real apparatus of collective thoughts, fears, beliefs, practices, and history. How do we counteract white privilege and white fragility? What's being done? I've noticed more Black people in commercials and movies, and Black people are shown in positions of authority. In Milwaukee, in our state, and in our country, there are more Black elected officials. More positive articles are being written about Black people. More workshops are being given, like ours. I know of 2 other parishes that have also given workshops, Our Lady of Lourdes and St. Sebastian's. And then 2 students from Menomonee Falls High School started a group called Awareness for Racial Inequality. They plan to create racial awareness and to address systemic racism in the school. Now we'll take a look at a video which gives an example of how white privilege can be used in a positive way. Dr. Joy DeBuy, who is an educator and author, tells of her experience in a grocery store.
You might want to turn up your volume for this. It's a little on the soft side. We turned it up as much as we could on the PowerPoint slide.
My sister-in-law, who's half Black, half white, but looks white, blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's a wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day, and Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me, and she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who is a strawberry blonde, um, freckled, very delightful, warm, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? Isn't it a nice day today? They're just chatting up, and she says, yeah. So Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up, no conversation. She looks up at me, absolutely no, just a little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point, my daughter, she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming up in her eye, like, Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do because behind me are 2 elderly white women. right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, some things you got to choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book, right? So this is the book that shows the people who've written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is in full blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over and she steps in and she says, "Excuse me, why are you doing this?" And the checker goes, "Well, what do you mean?" She goes, "Why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that?" She goes, "Well, this is our policy." She goes, "No, it's not your policy because you didn't do that with me." "Oh, well, I know you've been." She goes, "No, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months." And so at this point, the two white elderly ladies go, "Oh, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. And it's totally unacceptable." At which point the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, "Is there a problem here?" And then my sister-in-law again responds. She goes, "Yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened." So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the black woman said, "This is unfair. Why are you doing this to me?" Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do every single day.
So, a wonderful example of using white privilege in a positive way. In his article, Father Mazengale offers some active actions to counteract white privilege, white fragility, and racism. And they include, number 1, understand the difference between being uncomfortable and being threatened. And I just have to get. There is no way to tell the truth about race in this country without being uncomfortable. The only reason for racism's persistence is that white people continue to benefit from it. Silence, for the sake of making white people comfortable, is a luxury we can no longer afford, he wrote. Number 2, admit your ignorance and do something about it. There's a lot about our history and life that we are going to have to unlearn and learn over. And we shared some of this history in our first 2 sessions. Number 3, have the courage to confront your family and friends. Father Mazengale says, "I understand the desire to have peaceful or at least conflict-free relationships with family and friends." He quoted Dr. Martin Luther King, "There comes a time when silence is betrayal." And Father Mazengale adds, "Silence means consent, or at least complicity." I've been silent too many times when I've heard people make disparaging racial remarks. I need to be an interrupter, to speak up when a racial slur or derogatory comment is being made. Number 4, be unconditionally pro-life. Father Mazengale wrote that Pope John Paul II, in his final visit to the United States, summoned Catholics to eradicate every form of racism as part of their essential commitment to life. Number 5, pray. Yes, racism is a political issue and a social divide. But at its deepest level, racism is a soul sickness. The soul sickness can only be healed by deep prayer. Yes, we need social reforms, but only an invasion of divine love will shatter the small images of God that enable us to live undisturbed by the racism that benefits some and terrorizes so many. And finally, Jesus says in John's Gospel, love one another as I have loved you. We'll now hear the second half of Change Our Hearts, and then Joan will give guidelines and questions for our circle discussion groups. Thank you very much.
Shows the way that leads to your side, over the mountains and sands of the soul. Before us, manna, water from stone, light which says we never walk alone. Change our hearts. Your word says it can be. Change our lives this time. Your life, Lord, make us free. We are the people your call set apart. Lord, this time, change our this time, change our this time, change our
Before we write down our impressions, please join me in thanking Tony, Barb, and Mary Ann for their enlightening presentation. Let's give them a nice round of applause. Thank you. And now again, if you would just take your paper and pencil, write down your thoughts, your feelings, things that stay with you from the presentation. I'll give you 45 seconds to do that. And I'd like to talk about the process of the dialogue circles. These are based on the biblical concept of shalom, which is peace. And it's all about being in right relationship with God, self, others, and creation. Actually, it is a form of restorative practices. There are different types of circles, and we will do an issue circle tonight around this topic of white privilege and white fragility related to racism. And we hope that we can build some relationships in the process. There are some guidelines for the circles. We, including the facilitation team, agree to uphold the values of respect, relationship, responsibility, to speak from the heart, and to listen with respect. Please do not record any part of these circle conversations. Confidentiality is observed. What is said in the circle stays in the circle. This is sacred, safe space. Use I statements to tell your own story, your own experience, or opinion. There is no crosstalk. In other words, we don't respond to what another person says. We don't judge, criticize, give advice, or shame anyone in the group. We apply the principle of do no harm. We ask that you are respectful of time for the sake of everyone, so that everyone has a chance to speak. There will be an order of who speaks first, second, third, and so forth that will be set by the facilitator. Please observe that. And passing is always an option. If we were doing this in person, we would be passing around a talking piece. But since we are virtual, we'll just have an order. If you agree, please raise your hand. If there is anyone who disagrees, please speak out now. Okay, thank you. All right, here are the questions. Share your reactions about what you wrote in response to the presentation. The second one, how has white privilege affected my life in subtle or big ways? What action steps can I take to counter systemic racism? Okay, now that we're back in the large group, thank you so much for your sharing in the small group format. There's a few announcements as usual. First of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about the follow-up activities. And were you able to put these in the chat, Marguerite, or are they going to be on the website?
They're in the chat and they will be on the website tomorrow.
So the article that the team mentioned that some of the presentation was based on by Father Brian Massengale on white privilege. There's a link to that article. There's also a link to a video with a workshop by Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the book, White Fragility. Those, excellent speakers and authors. And then I happened to come across, there's an opportunity for us to participate in a virtual event. It's coming up on June 17th. It's called Shedding White Privilege and Working for Racial Justice with Andrew Like. And he is I believe he's the coordinator of African American ministry in Chicago. And it's through an organization called Future Church, and it's free. So we'll be putting a link to that event on the website as well as in the chat. So we encourage you to participate in some of these follow-up activities. In our group, we were talking how much education is so key to changing our hearts and minds, like the song said. And like I said in the first session, I thought I knew some things about this issue until I started to read all these books and attend all these virtual events. And I just felt like I had known just a little, and I felt like my eyes were really opened. So we would encourage you to continue your education too. We are hoping to continue to study and take action after our last event next Tuesday by forming a committee that will continue to study and learn and take action steps. And so next week, we're going to ask you if you'd like to join us. And so I ask God to bless your discernment about that. And there might be different levels at which people do get involved. Next week is our last session on May 11th, and I will be presenting on the topic of racialized trauma and healing. So we invite you to come back for that and tell folks that you know and invite them to attend too. And we will just close with a brief prayer, and I'm going to share my screen once again. Okay, again, if you would, mute your microphones and just pray from your space there. It's difficult to try to do it all together. I will read the verses, and if you could please join me in the response. May the nations be glad and exult because you rule the peoples in equity. The nations on the earth you guide. Oh God, let all the nations praise you. May all the peoples praise you, O God. May all the peoples praise you. May God bless you, and may all the ends of the earth revere God. Oh God,
Oh God,
all
let all the
Let all
nations
nations
you.
praise you.
Sing good night and peace be with you. Hope to see you next week.
Good night, everybody.
Night.
Good
Good
night.
night.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Good night.
Thanks, team, for the presentation. It was great.
Thanks.